We're going to look at the settlement patterns and look at where people live, but also how they use the land in the Foundry. In the Foundry, it's very dense in terms of population compared to other particular nations that we're going to look at, but that doesn't mean it's all urban. It doesn't mean it's all a bunch of towns and cities. In fact, you're going to find a very big diversity in the Foundry. We have rural areas. We got Amish people living in the same region as Wall Street executives and big shots there living in Manhattan. So the Foundry is going to include a couple different sub-regions. And we've talked about this beforehand. We've got the megalopolis that are kind of separated from the rest of the Foundry by the Appalachian Mountains. And the Appalachian Mountains separates the megalopolis on one side, very dense urban area, but also rural areas there as well, from the Rust Belt, or what we think of as the Great Lakes area. In the Rust Belt, we're also going to include the core of Canada, and so they call it the Canadian Corridor. Get it? Corridor, because it's kind of this corridor. It's this narrow, thin area of dense population settlement, but also industry and all kinds of different jobs and economic development in that part of Canada. And that also includes Montreal, but we've already talked about Quebec. So it's an introduction to the different subregions. Now let's go ahead and throw on top of that the population density. We can see that dense urban area that goes from Boston down the shore to Providence, Hartford, and we eventually get to Bridgeport, New York, and eventually that works its way down to Philadelphia and Newark, and then Baltimore and Washington, D.C. And if you've lived in this particular area, or if you traveled this particular area, it's just one massive urban area. Now, there are rural areas. You can see this little rural area there, and a little rural area there around Pennsylvania, around Philadelphia, which you do find a lot of Amish. But for the most part, this is a very dense urban area, one of the densest areas that you're going to find in the Western Hemisphere as far as population all living close together. You might find this also in Brazil, along the Atlantic coast there, but this is, in terms of the Western Hemisphere, very dense population. Now we go across the Appalachians. We can see the Appalachians essentially do a good job of separating the Foundry into two different areas, and very sparsely populated through Pennsylvania, West Virginia. And so even though you might be in northern Pennsylvania, you might have more characteristics similar to someone from southern West Virginia in terms of the remoteness, rurality. Then you get to the Rust Belt and the Great Lakes cities, and although you might be, if you've ever been to northern Indiana, like, oh my God, there's nobody up here. Actually, compared to other parts, it is relatively densely packed. We do see a little bit more color, a little bit more red in this particular area, a little bit more of that orange color, which do represent a little bit more densely packed area. And so what we could say is we have higher density rural areas in the Foundry than we would find in other particular nations where it's much more spread out. Other things we notice is a bunch of little pockets of urban areas, small towns, so Cincinnati, Dayton, Columbus, Indianapolis, but then we have the smaller towns, Anderson, Kokomo's, Muncie's, Richmond's, Lafayette's, Chicago, Milwaukee. All of this will comprise the Rust Belt. Some would even say that farther out, you go to the Quad Cities, where they, manufacturing out there. John Deere is out here. You go out in this particular area, used to manufacture, still do to a certain degree, very small degree, washing machines. So the Rust Belt is anywhere where we find large amounts of manufacturing, and we see that in this dense industrial American heartland. Going over to our good friends in Canada, it's pretty much from Detroit, from Windsor, all the way along this corridor, including Niagara, Hamilton, Toronto, and all the suburban areas of Toronto. Definitely the economic core of eastern Canada, along the St. Lawrence Seaway, along the St. Lawrence River through eventually to Montreal and Quebec. And so those are in Quebec, are a different nation, but we could say the Canadian core does overlap into overlap into Quebec. Now look at terms of anthropogenic biomes. Another pattern we see here. Of course, we can see that dense urban settlement. There are some pockets of cropland that we see here. Also some areas of suburbia. Then we have this very much this remote area of forest that bisects, once again, the particular nation we're looking at here, the Foundry. Then it changes. Then we have much more cropland. We get more of this remote cropland as we go farther to the west in the Foundry. And so the Foundry, very dense on one side. As you go farther to the west, you go through very much a remote forested upland region, and then you get to very industrial, mixed in with a lot of cities and urban areas, mixed in with a lot of cropland areas, and corn and beans are what we find overwhelmingly here in this part of the Rust Belt. Also, we could say the Rust Belt definitely includes the Canadian core. It definitely overlaps into Canada, doesn't stop just at the country line, but we could say that this area here also very similar to the Rust Belt, in which you see dense urban areas, scattered cities, might have some manufacturing scattered here and there, combined with some population, some suburban areas, combined with some cropland and more remote areas, more remote cropland. As you go away from the corridor, the Canadian corridor, there's no doubt you can see this particular pattern in terms of things change, much more dense forested area. And this might be still Ontario, but in the extreme southern part of Ontario, this kind of peninsular part that sticks out here amongst the Great Lakes is by far the economic core, but the industrial core, and very much similar to what we would find on the other side of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario in the Rust Belt.